In news from North Africa, Tunisians are voting today on whether to accept a new constitution put forward by President Kais Saied. Under the new constitution, President Saied will continue to rule until a new parliament is voted in later this year. It also states that the government appointed by him will not face a confidence vote in parliament. For developments in the North African nation, we're joined by Meshakal Edito-in-Chief, Fadil, Aliriza. Fadil, thank you very much for availing yourself this morning. We saw a number of people turn up on the streets of Tunis yesterday in protest of today. I do wonder whether those scores of people have translated in terms of numbers at the polls, or they've decided to stay home.
Yeah, well, many of the parties who are against this referendum have said that they would actually like to boycott. Most of the major parties are saying that calling on their supporters to boycott the referendum. They think that the way that this referendum is being held, they feel that there's issues with the electoral body. They feel that there's been a very short time period for people to have a look at the constitution. They feel that it's being done without real consultation from multiple parties, that the drafting process itself was not very inclusive. And we've even seen that some of the legal scholars themselves who were involved in the drafting process, the draft that they turned into the president was then later basically changed drastically by the president himself. So these are some of the reasons why we might see actually more of a boycott rather than a no vote today on the referendum. That said, we'll have to see what the turnout actually is in the end.
I do wonder, though, in terms of the contents of the proposed new constitution by the president, outside of giving himself absolute powers, the relationship between religion and state, which is a new point that is causing some tension.
There was already a sort of a reference to Islam in the last constitution in 2014. We're seeing that there's an update on that, so it's not necessarily saying that the state's religion is Islam, but it's saying that the state has a role to play in putting forward Islam. So there's been quite a lot of debate about that. It's been a bit controversial. But that said, that controversy has not really filtered down to a popular debate. It seems that people who say that they're voting yes for this constitution are really not looking at the role of Islam. They're really trying to give basically a mandate to President Kais Saied. So these are people who are saying that they would like to see at the back of political parties that have been ruling since 2011, since the first revolution, and that they see that these last 10 years have not really responded to the needs and demands of ordinary Tunisians, specifically on economic and socioeconomic issues. And so this is part of what we're hearing from the people who are voting yes on this referendum. For those who are voting no, the question of Islam doesn't appear to be the most important one, although it is a factor. What we're seeing is really the challenge is that this is going to be doing away with a lot of the checks on the president's power. So this is going towards a very hyper-presidential system. Even one of the drafters said the draft that he no longer recognizes, he called it, in fact, a dictatorial system. So these are some of the concerns of people who are voting no or even boycotting the vote altogether today.
On the socio-economic situation and the concerns around the economy, inflation is quite high also in the country. Outside of being a journalist, you are a Tunisian. I guess just maybe if you can personalize it for us and tell us your experience of living in that country and what this now does to you on an individual basis.
I'm not Tunisian, just to clarify. I have quite a lot of family who are Tunisian. I've been in Tunisia covering it for a decade, but certainly I work very closely. We have many most of our journalists are Tunisian journalists from Meshakal, and when we talk to people, we often try to focus on the demands and the voices of people who are often not heard, and that includes working class people who are struggling really with what you said. You mentioned inflation. Inflation has gotten particularly worse since 2016, when we saw that there was a depreciation of the dinar. This is one of the conditions that came with an IMF loan at the time. In fact, there's negotiations for a new IMF loan, which are expected to have more austerity measures, particularly when we see freezing of hiring in the public sector, freezes in public sector wages. This is at a time when we see that there's quite a glaring lack in some of the public services, whether that's transportation, education, and certainly healthcare. During the COVID crisis, at some point, Tunisia had the worst deaths per capita in COVID crisis during the COVID crisis, and so it didn't have enough doctors to respond to it, and something that really led to some of the popularity of President Kais Saied's moves last year.
If you go online, you might get a different picture, right? Especially when it comes to social media influencers. I do wonder how much of this dynamic you are aware of, where there are some people who are not necessarily from the country who come in as tourists, and they take these videos and they upload them online. I saw one as recent as a month ago titled, I do beg your pardon, it was titled Tunisia, the most free country, in the Muslim world. And they were asking ordinary Tunisians about the experience of living in the country. And they painted a happy-go-lucky picture. But there are claims that these social media influencers are state-sponsored. Are you aware of this?
I'm not aware of any state sponsorship. I have seen tourists coming back to Tunisia now that the borders are open and there's less COVID restrictions than before. Certainly tourism is extremely important economically here in Tunisia, and that's one of the reasons why we do see promotion of tourism. That said, when you do compare Tunisia to other countries that saw uprisings in the Arab world and North Africa in 2011, certainly Tunisia still continues to have more freedoms for the press. Now that is shrinking. Certainly we've seen that shrinking over the last several years, and we've seen particularly since President Kais Saied's moves in July last year, we have seen more and more constraints on the ability of journalists to do their job. So freedom of expression, freedom of the press are certainly very much the forefront of people who are human rights activists and advocates who are concerned about the direction that the country is going.
In terms of the voting currently underway today, how soon can we expect the result? What happens now?
Well, yeah, the polling stations will actually be open quite late, from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. tonight local time. This is longer than we've seen before, so it may be some time before we get the results. That said, we've already seen a turnout from Tunisians voting abroad. They started a couple of days earlier, lower than we've seen in previous elections. So it may be the case that the big story tonight will not necessarily be about the final decision on Tunisians, whether yes or no, but actually the turnout, because there isn't a minimum threshold for whether or not this will be a legitimate vote. Even if there's less than 30%, it may be considered as legitimate by the president. And in the draft constitution, it appears that regardless of the result, this may in fact be the constitution that's put forward today after the vote.
Thank you very much for availing yourself. Fadil Aliriza, founder and editor-in-chief of Meshakal, a Tunisian-based publication.